Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk about a different lake. Let's talk about Great Salt Lake.
Yeah.
You've been involved with the Great Salt Lake and the problems that it's going through right now. Could you speak a little bit about what's going on with the Great Salt Lake and what what can we maybe we can talk about what we can do later. But give us what's the problem with the Great Salt Lake right now?
So the Great Salt Lake is what we call a terminal lake. It doesn't have an outlet to the ocean. And about a quarter of the Earth's land surface is covered by watersheds that are just like this. And about half of the Earth's lake volume is in salt lakes, like Great Salt Lake. So this isn't a weird or unique ecosystem. It's a very common ecosystem. It's also very important because these lakes only form in semi-arid or arid regions, so dry regions. If you have enough precipitation, it'll just fill up that basin until it can cut a channel to the ocean. But that means that the lake habitat and its wetlands are really important for the ecosystem to function, removing pollutants, providing habitat for all of the biodiversity that the Earth system depends on. And then these lake systems are very important economically. So we've got to take care of them, but it's really hard to take care of them because they're very finely tuned hydrologically. A little bit too much water, they fill up unnaturally, a little bit too little water, and they start to dry. And that second problem is what's going on with Great Salt Lake and most of the endorheic lakes in the world. So globally, we've lost over half of the salt lake area. This is the Aral Sea, Lake Ermia, Owens Lake, Mono Lake, hundreds and thousands of lakes around the world. They're disappearing. And they're disappearing primarily because of irrigated agriculture. We divert water, not from the lake, but from the freshwater tributaries, the rivers flowing to the lake. And that is the lifeblood of these systems. They depend on fresh water arriving. Now, when the Mormon pioneers arrived in this region, even before Brigham Young arrived, the day before, the very first thing that they did was divert a small stream in the Salt Lake Valley and plant potatoes. That actually was not an issue. It was relatively small-scale farming. It was what we call subsistence farming. They were growing food for the local area. And for about 100 years, they were living within the realm of what the lake system could sustain. But in the mid-1900s, the country got on this dam building kick. It was kind of a source of national pride. Who could build the biggest dam, the Army Corps of Engineers or the Bureau of Reclamation? And we see in the Great Salt Lake watershed, this is when Deer Creek Reservoir was built a little bit later on. Jordanelle Reservoir was built, and all of the other dams in the watershed. This allowed us it created an artificial surplus of water. That maybe sounds funny, but there was a natural limit in how much water we could divert and use. And once those dams were in place, we could grow a lot more agricultural crops. And specifically, this is when alfalfa started to become dominant. It used to be you wouldn't raise alfalfa because not very profitable, and you can't eat alfalfa, right? You only can feed it to livestock, which is a pretty inefficient way. If you're trying to make sure that everybody has enough food, you follow the word of wisdom, speaking from a church perspective, and eat mainly plants. That's much more efficient agricultural system. But this kind of animal-based livestock agriculture developed after all those federal projects went through. And we can see the lake transition into this strong decline. The lake level started to go down. Interestingly, it almost bottomed out in the 1960s. And a real crisis there, but then a natural wet period called a pluvial, multiple years, well above average precipitation, actually multiple decades, filled up the lake and then got to a point in the 1980s where it was full. And it wasn't flooding and it wasn't unhealthy, but the issue was we had built infrastructure all around the lake, and so we were unhappy when the lake was coming back to its natural level. It was too high for the human development that had happened around it. So it flooded the airport, for example, and but that was just a little blip. Since that time, the lake level has been going down, and we're now in a situation where we are potentially months or at most a few years away from the lake ecosystem collapsing. We've diverted so much water. Over the last 3 years, we've diverted 2/3 of the water that would naturally flow to the lake and used it primarily for agriculture, secondarily for outdoor irrigation, lawns, decorative plants outdoors. So I think we still haven't come to grips with how big a deal this is.
Mm.
If you look at the loss of Lake Urmia in Iran, or the destruction of the Aral Sea in the former Soviet Union, when those lakes were lost, it basically caused civilizational decline.
Mm.
The communities around those lakes saw big increases in all sorts of air quality issues. So one of the things you don't realize is you dry out that lake, it's a huge source of toxic dust. So you see clusters of cancer, respiratory disease, heart disease, reproductive disorders in those areas. Huge impact on the economy. The agricultural activity that caused the decline of those lakes then is destroyed by the lack of water vapor that's coming from the lake and the toxic dust that's coming from the lake. So causes structural economic decline and will impact our snow. Mm-hmm. So that dust is deposited on the snow and can cause pollution and then also early meltout. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the 10 million migratory birds that move through that system which I believe we have a responsibility to care for as part of God's creation. They won't have a place to go. And if this had happened, 50 years ago in the 1960s, there still was a lot of habitat around in other places. So they could have maybe taken a different path through the Great Basin. We've lost so much habitat now to agriculture and urbanization that there aren't other places for them to go. Mm-hmm. We're already starting to see these populations be impacted by the brine shrimp collapsing and the brine flies collapsing. So we've got to act quick to avoid catastrophe.
And there's been at least noise about this from the governor, from other legislators, and community members, and then the Utah, or the consortium that exists.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is it real?
Yeah.
Is this real noise, or is it just political noise?
I think it's a little bit of both.
Okay.
So last year, the legislature made really important changes. They were described as generational changes to Utah water law that are going to encourage conservation in the long term. Really positive developments there. But the full benefit of those changes to law are still probably 5 or 10 years out before we start to see conservation because of that. And so last month we published a report at gsl.byu.edu that calls for an emergency response on top of that. So we've made some good long-term changes, but the lake has lost 3/4 of its water, 2/3 of its area. It's just a remnant of what it was before. And we need an infusion of fresh water. And if you could see out the window, we have above average snowpack this year. We need that snow to get to Great Salt Lake. And it may not. There is a scenario where the snowmelt happens, we keep it in reservoirs, and then it's used, because water in the Great Salt Lake watershed is over allocated. So that means there are more people trying to use it than there is actual water. There's more paper water, that means the rights, than there is wet water, the actual water.
And who owns most of that water rights? Is that the agricultural?
It's agricultural, yeah, mostly. Cities have rights to that as well, but that only represents around 9% of the consumptive water use. So we're primarily talking about agriculture and then outdoor water use. So, but getting back to your question, we've made some really good progress, but we need to be absolutely clear here that we are facing a real threat to our way of life. And I don't say that casually. That we don't have to use some advanced scientific model to predict this. We just have to look next door in California. Owens Lake was a lake that's about 15 times smaller than Great Salt Lake, and more than 100 miles away from a big urban center. LA County literally stole the water from Owens Lake, put it in an aqueduct and brought it to LA County. The lake dried out. It became the single largest source of particulate matter pollution in the entire United States.
Wow.
And they've now spent about $4 billion not restoring the lake ecosystem, but just trying to suppress the dust.
Oh.
Right? So they're not getting any of the ecological benefits, none of the recreational benefits from that. But because they let the ecosystem become degraded, it now is affecting that area in a huge way. And that's why, I mean, think about our ancestors, all of the phrases and beliefs that they had of living within our means, or an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. In this case, it's a gallon of water is worth an acre foot of cure, right? Like, if we head this off on the front end and recognize we need to live within our means, there is enough and to spare if we use the gifts of God in a wise way, and if we are careful caretakers of creation.
Yeah, it's funny because that scripture of "there's enough to spare," I've heard some people use in a way like, we don't need to worry about conservation, we don't need to worry about the future, and also the millennium is coming anyway, and so that's the kind of speech. Or even, well, if there's a problem, let's just pray to God to give us some more rain. And I mean, it seems like you're saying maybe there's a better pathway.
Thank you for bringing up all those topics. I think they're really important. First, I'd say it's the science and engineering is not enough to solve this problem. And in fact, the engineering in particular, this infrastructure, is what created the problem. So we need to be thinking about what are our values as a community. What's the legacy that we want to leave? That's beyond the realm of science, right? That's about what we believe our responsibilities are. And it's section 104 of the Doctrine and Covenants that has that verse, enough and to spare. And I encourage everyone to go back and read that section. It is one of the most powerful and important environmental scriptures, not only in our faith tradition, but anywhere in Christian and non-Christian beliefs. It's very clear. It describes that we will be held accountable for the way that we take care of God's creation. This is, of course, echoing the first commandment that God gave to Adam and Eve, to replenish the earth, to care for the garden, right? So this is really important to God. It's very clear. There also is a promise. If we take care of the resources around us, if we use them conservatively, if we don't ever waste them, if we share them with the needy, that's the number one thing that we're supposed to do with the riches of the earth, as Christ commanded us, to take care of the poor and vulnerable, then there will be enough and to spare.
Yeah.
But it's a real distortion to take out the promise without what's on our side.
Exactly.
And I think we as a community understand that, this idea of a covenant, right? Where we make a promise, we make an offering to God, there is a promise given in return.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, that's really a more, for me, fruitful way to think about stewardship.
Yeah.
Right? And as a community and as a church, I don't think that we've maybe done enough. I really appreciated the general conference talk that happened.
Yeah.
I think I think that's the first time that we've had like an entire talk dedicated to stewardship.
Yeah, in my memory, if you go back, there had been talks, in the past, but this one was really beautiful as the focus.
Yeah. So maybe and like you're saying, it's not a technological thing. It's really, we need to change the hearts and minds of the people that are here, so that we change the way that we think about that water use.
That's right. You made this comment about the second coming, right? And I think it's helpful to think about our bodies. So we know that our bodies will die at some point, and that they will be resurrected. Would we ever use that knowledge to say, therefore, it doesn't matter what I do with my body.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what I take into it, or how I treat it. No, the way that we treat our bodies reflects our understanding of God, and in fact, the first commandment, Christ's first great commandment, to love God. How can we do that if we are destroying God's creation, whether that's our body or the broader world around us?
Yeah, and there's kind of that doctrine that we have of the kind of person that you are in this life, you're going to raise.
Yep.
And it's kind of like if we can't take care of this world, that supposedly is a celestial world, like how are we going to take care of a celestial world?
Well, there too, the world is a telestial world as it relates to our current society.
Sure.
In section 88 of the Doctrine and Covenants, it says that the earth abides a celestial law already. And so when we look at the ecosystems around us, it can be tempting to say, oh, we really need to change them to meet our desires.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, and Brigham Young taught this the most clear, speaking of conference talks, he right in his official writing says, we should be seeking to abide the same law that the earth follows. So we should be using the pattern. You know, in nature, there isn't any toxic waste. Everything is a circle. So any of the byproducts end up being resources that can be used again. You're living in a sustainable way. You're supporting the other organisms there. If ever that isn't happening, we call it disease or a parasite, right? Something negative. So we need to be learning from all of that rather than saying we're going to radically transform this watershed or this region to meet our desires right now. That's a clear sign that we've misunderstood what God is trying to teach us.
Yeah.